Hello. So today I'm going to present about the landscape of emancipation of colonial Saint Louis in Senegal. So first, some context notes. There'll be some mentions of racism, colonial violence, and enslavement in this presentation. So archaeological studies of enslavement have a long history and basically started as a sub-discipline in the 1970s in the United States, in the wake of the African American civil rights movement. The desire to historicize enslavement has led to both archaeological studies of slave raiding and emancipation. However, despite the growth of this subdiscipline, archaeological studies of emancipation remain still relatively rare in Africa, and only very few papers deal with the subject. So this presentation therefore focuses on the landscape of emancipation in West Africa, in the hinterland of colonial Saint Louis, here in northern Senegal. The main line of inquiry will address how the autonomy of enslaved and formerly enslaved people and the colonial discipline of the French administration interacted in this landscape. I'm sorry for the formatting, I don't know what is going on. So the city of Saint Louis was founded in 1659 by the French as a trading post. The colonial society of Saint Louis was very fractured along racial lines, with a wealthy elite composed of European, mixed race, and free Africans, and a very large enslaved population, making up nearly 50% of the population of Saint Louis in 1845. The economy of the city and its hinterland therefore relied intensely on this enslaved labor. Also, if you look at mainstream media articles written today about slavery in Senegal, most represent enslaved people as men, but in reality at the time, up to 2/3 of enslaved people were women. So this is a timeline of the abolition of enslavement in Senegal. So the transatlantic slave trade was first prohibited in 1818. This resulted in a reduction of the supply of cheap labor, which led the colonial administration to create a system of indentured labor called the engagé à temps, where wealthy owners were able to acquire enslaved people as long as they promised to free them after 14 years, although this in reality rarely happened. Enslavement was eventually abolished in the French Empire in 1848. However, in Senegal, this only applied to the colonial city of Saint Louis and Gorée, and enslavement continued to exist in the rest of the country. The coexistence of these two systems led to an influx of enslaved people coming from neighboring kingdoms into the city of Saint Louis to seek freedom. For instance, in the year directly following abolition, around 4,000 enslaved people arrived in the city of Saint Louis from Cayo, a neighboring kingdom. It's in this context that the colonial administration created settlements called freedom villages to contain the influx of free people. And enslavement was eventually abolished only in 1905 in the rest of Senegal. So in this presentation, I'll rely on three main sources. Firstly, archival documents from the French Overseas Archive in Aix-en-Provence and from the National Archive of Senegal in Dakar. Oral history interview conducted in northern Senegal, and archaeological excavation realized this year in April, also in northern Senegal with other postgraduate students from the University of Dakar. This research was part of a collaborative project between the University of Cambridge and the University of Dakar, funded by the Cambridge Africa Alberta Trust, which gave me the opportunity to spend a month in Senegal. And I would therefore like to thank Professor Lang from Cambridge and Professor Thieu from Dakar, who received the original funding, as well as Youssou Touré and René Dianafai, two postgraduate students from Dakar who also specialize in emancipation and whose help was invaluable during my trip in Senegal. So in the hinterland of Saint Louis, archival documents and secondary sources enable to identify a variety of sites associated with emancipation. Chronologically, the first ones of these sites are associated with the system of the engagé à temps mentioned earlier. These sites ran from colonial plantation, which location you can see on this map, to the colonial prison of Saint Louis, where enslaved people and engagé à temps were represented. A second range of sites associated with emancipation are the ones that were created by the colonial administration in the direct aftermath of the abolition of 1848, mainly to contain the influx of freed people. Around Saint Louis, there are 5 of these freedom villages. These are the neighborhood of Ndartut and Saul at the outskirts of the city of Saint Louis, and the villages of Lamsar, Meriganagan, and Jagger in the hinterland. These 3 later sites were located near French forts, which means that the 1848 decree abolishing slavery also applied to them. All of these sites were heavily surveilled by the colonial administration, and there seems to have been frequent tensions between the French and the freed inhabitants of the freedom villages. Finally, in the late 19th century, various overlapping diasporas towards Saint Louis led to the creation of new emancipative sites, including self-constituted communities of freed people and religious missions which welcome fleeing enslaved people, such as the Protestant mission of Caux at the outskirts of Saint Louis. So sites associated with emancipation in the 19th century therefore ranged from plantation where indentured laborers were put to work, to colonial prisons, to freedom villages created by the colonial administration, to religious missions, and to self-constituted communities. Of the 5 freedom villages created after 1848, Lamsar, Meriganagan, and Jagger were located next to colonial fort, while Ndartut and Saul were heavily surveilled by the colonial administration. These increasingly militarized landscapes are clearly visible on historical maps. For instance, the freedom village of Ndartut was enclosed by a fence. Houses were organized according to a grid pattern, and the military regularly surveilled the site to ensure that no one would leave unauthorized. In some areas, this surveillance continued for decades. For instance, this is a map of the freedom village of Ninjago in 1879. It shows that 3 decades after abolition, the militarized landscape directly surrounding Jago had largely expanded, with the addition of soldier barracks and other military units, and large gardens cultivated by villagers for feeding the military troops. So this map illustrates how freed people in the settlements came to be seen as a reserve army of labor, that is a disposable, cheap workforce that colonial administration could use. In Jago, the military administration, for instance, used the inhabitants to till the gardens to feed the army, while in Ndartut, the inhabitants were kept segregated and served the wealthy urban elite as a cheap domestic labor force. So this internment of freed people in segregated freedom villages also corresponds to the development and spread of racist discourses about the supposed laziness and antisocial behavior of formerly enslaved people. And the use of freed people as disposable labor by the colonial administration and internment in surveilled freedom villages or in colonial prisons is therefore an example of the necropolitical drive of the French administration, that is, of the power of the colonial administration to make disposable the life of these racialized populations. However, it's also important to emphasize that despite the French colonial control and discipline, enslaved people were not like passive actors, but rather central agents in their own emancipation. Archival documents provide many examples of collective resistance and of the desire of autonomy of enslaved and liberated people. In a colonial inquiry from the 1840s, an enslaved sailor named Malien Bai is recording having said, "When I'll be free, I will have nothing else to desire because I will receive in full the fruits of my labor." In 1848, in the months preceding the abolition of slavery in Saint Louis, local administrators mentioned that enslaved people in the city had politically self-organized and had formed an emancipation club, which counted up to 500 enslaved people. The political power of Saint Louis enslaved people was also illustrated that same year when 400 of them protested in front of the courthouse. The flight of enslaved people from their enslaver was also one of the main phenomena that eventually forced the colonial power to grant freedom. And several thousands of enslaved people fled their enslavers in the late 19th century. And most of the freedom villages mentioned earlier were formed by these fleeing enslaved people. The desire for autonomy of liberated people is also partially visible in the material culture. In several test pits, we dug this April in the Freedom Village of Lansar. Little imported European material was found, while these are usually very common in sites of the period. Although more study will need to be realized, a potential hypothesis is that the inhabitants of the Freedom Villages actually rejected European material. In addition, ceramics found in areas of the site likely associated with the liberated newcomers were more decorated and with more stylistic variations than ceramics from older parts of the site. This might point to processes of innovation or world making of formerly enslaved people, although again, further analysis will be needed. So Saidia Hartman has developed the concept of afterlife of slavery to describe the premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment of freed people and their descendants. However, despite the growth of archaeology of enslavement and the repeated calls to make archaeology more relevant to living communities, studies of these violent afterlives of slavery have so far been missing in the discipline. For instance, one of the examples frequently mentioned of afterlives of slavery are the increased rates of incarceration of descendants of enslaved people. These carceral legacies are very visible in the hinterland of Saint Louis, where the carceral landscape of the 20th century often overlaps with the landscape of emancipation of the 19th century. Freedom villages themselves can be considered as proto-carceral sites. And if we take the example of youth detention centers, many of the first ones to be created in the 20th century in the regions of Saint Louis were located near sites that had previously been associated with liberated people. And indeed, often most of the young people detained were themselves liberated minors. More generally, descendants of enslaved people are still stigmatized and discriminated against in Senegal. For instance, in 2015, the former president of Senegal accused his successor of being a descendant of slaves and hence not suitable for the office. Throughout the last century, families of enslaved descent have made use of various strategies to escape this stigma, including by intermarrying with families of free descent. Today, there are campaign groups such as Endam Bilali, which fight against this stigma around enslaved origins. Finally, the cheap labor provided by enslaved people and liberated people enabled the mass accumulation of wealth by colonial powers, resulting today in the inequalities that we see between the West and formerly colonized countries. The hinterland of Saint Louis was historically exploited by European powers for its labor and resources. And today the region still suffers from the continued legacies of this exploitation, including through socioeconomic precarity, depopulation, and the destructive effects of the climate crisis, as mentioned in the presentation before. Many grassroots movements have denounced this continued afterlife of enslavement and colonialism, and archaeological study could wait in these debates by providing material evidences and supporting structural changes. For instance, wealth reparation from northern countries to formerly colonized communities. So, in summary, this research has shown the variety of places associated with emancipation in the hinterland of Saint Louis, including freedom villages, plantation, colonial prisons, and religious missions. It has shown enslaved people were central agents in their own emancipation through flight and collective resistance, and also they built new lives for themselves through world making and social integration. It has also shown that this autonomy of formerly enslaved people had to face the colonial discipline and necropolitics of the French administration, which tried to continue exploiting the labor of liberated people. And finally, the last part has shown the potential of integrating archaeology of emancipation with studies of the afterlife of enslavement to demonstrate the legacies of enslavement and colonialism and advocate for structural change and restorative futures. Thank you.